everyone, it's Celeste with Gulf Coast Bird Observatory. Today I'm going to be telling you about one of our ongoing research projects. It's the American Oystercatcher study, which our Director of Conservation Research, Susan Heath, has been working on for 10 years. In this study, Dr. Heath investigates the western Gulf population of American oystercatchers. The American oystercatcher is a bird species of high concern. Through this study, we've learned a lot about the life history of Gulf Coast oystercatchers. We've discovered that the western Gulf oystercatchers prefer to nest on bay islands. Because of this, they are subject to overwash, predation, and human disturbance. These and other factors put pressure on the struggling oystercatcher population. To get an idea of what this research actually consists of, I joined Dr. Heath on a visit to some of her research sites. I headed out on GCBO's own boat along with our intern Morgan, coastal biologist Taylor, and of course, Dr. Heath. American oystercatchers like to hang out on these bay reefs made out of oyster shells. There are many different factors in Dr. Heath's study, and one of them is water levels. If the water levels are too high, the bird's nest can be washed away and the eggs will die. Sue measures the elevation at the high point of each reef, so she can tell at what tide level the reefs become exposed and thus available for bird use. We searched the bay for oystercatchers and found a pair pretty quickly. The pair, which Sue recognized, wasn't where she expected them to be. American oystercatchers tend to be monogamous. The male and female will stay together throughout the breeding and nesting season, sharing responsibility for incubating the eggs and taking care of the chicks. Often these couples will stay together year after year and return to the same area every year to mate. This pair was on an island that Sue hadn't seen them on before, and they were acting kind of suspicious, as if they had a nest. Sue got out of the boat and explored the island and the islands nearby. She looked for any signs of a nest, but there were none. When American oystercatchers nest, they don't do it in a tree or bush. Rather, they do it on the ground. To make the nest bowl, they create a shallow indentation called a scrape. Then they lay their eggs directly in the bowl and incubate them until the chicks hatch. When looking for oystercatcher nests, Sue looks for scrapes, footprints, and of course eggs. She also pays attention to how the parents are acting when she's looking around. If they keep an eye on her, do alarm calls, or try to lead her away, it might indicate that they have a nest. To keep track of the oystercatchers, Dr. Heath bands them. Without bands, it would be impossible to keep track of which bird was which over the course of 10 years and thousands of miles. Dr. Heath bands her birds with metal bands and maroon-colored bands with white letters and numbers. The letters on the bands are big enough to see with binoculars, so we can avoid getting close and bothering the birds when we study them. Sue's birds are tagged with either 2-letter or 3-letter codes. For the 2-letter code, you can read it by starting with the underlined letter on the left and reading to the right. So this code is L5 and not 5L. For the 3-letter codes, you can start by reading the letter on top, followed by the letter on the bottom to the left and then to the right. So this one is W1Y. Each code is repeated twice on the band. And for Sue's project, the bands are the same on both legs. Today, Dr. Heath wants to band a new chick that she's been monitoring. We caught the chick and brought it back to the boat to band it. I got to hold the chick as Sue banded it and measured the bill length, wing length, weight, and other measurements. Taking these measurements is important for keeping track of the health of the bird. Then Sue took the chick back to its island and let it go. We hurried away so as not to bother them further, and the chick ran off to its parents. The next day, we headed out into another study area, East Matagorda Bay. We saw a lot more wildlife in this bay, including a dolphin, brown pelicans, roseate spoonbills, and even a magnificent frigate bird. It was a fun safari for me, but for the American oystercatchers, having so many neighbors can be problematic. Oystercatchers are territorial, but with nesting habitat so hard to come by, sometimes they find themselves on islands with other nesting shorebirds or water birds. This puts more strain on the oystercatchers to find sufficient food, habitat, and other resources. Some water birds can even predate the oystercatchers' chicks and eggs. These laughing gulls, for example, are prolific predators. We ended up finding a new oystercatcher nest. Sue notes the number of eggs, how the parents are acting, and even what substrate the nest is on. She also takes a GPS point so she can find the nest again. Dr. Sue has analyzed all of the data that she's collected over 10 years. She can now say with certainty that American oystercatchers who nest on the mainland are usually unsuccessful. There are too many predators and other dangers, and the eggs and chicks don't often make it to adulthood. American oystercatchers who nest on bay islands have far better luck. But if the island is too big, they often have to share their space with colonies of laughing gulls. These gulls eat the oystercatcher chicks and eggs, so those nests don't generally make it either. The most successful nests were found on bay islands that were too small for laughing gull colonies, but big enough that they weren't washed over by waves during a storm. That's a very specific nesting habitat. This is crucial information for those who want to help these birds. In order to create more nesting habitat, we need to build up more small bay islands. Without Dr. Sue's research, we would have never known how to save this population of American oystercatchers. Thanks, Dr. Sue! Now that the study has been going on for many years, there are over 350 banded American oystercatchers in Texas. If you see one and know what the code says, please report it to Dr. Sue at sheath@gcbo.org. If you can get a photo of the code, that would be even better. We really appreciate your support.